It's kind of crazy to think that as recently as 30 years ago, if you wanted to make beer in your home, you'd have to break the law. Thankfully, in 1978, it became legal on the federal level for people to homebrew, but unfortunately, this didn't include everyone, as certain states continued to restrict this natural right. But this all ended in 2013 when the last two holdouts, Mississippi and Alabama, passed laws making it okay for people to make beer at home. For the first time since Prohibition, it was legal to homebrew in all 50 of the United States. This was due in large part to the dedication and hard work of the American Homebrewers Association. In addition to continuing the fight for our right to brew, they're committed to growing the hobby by coordinating events such as Big Brew for National Homebrew Day and HomebrewCon. We're proud to say that the Brewlosophy podcast is brought to you by the American Homebrewers Association and encourage all of our listeners to support the organization that has done so much for this hobby by becoming a member today.
Viewed by many as being one of the most important aspects of making good beer, yeast starters are used to increase the number of cells a brewer pitches into their beer. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and in this episode of the Brewlosophy podcast, contributor Jake Huolihan joins me to chat about this method that really seems to have become a norm among homebrewers over the last decade.
Yeah, I know. I make starters for most batches these days. I'm putting together some notes for this specific podcast. I remember my first yeast starter was made with an old broken growler, and I'm pretty sure it didn't actually do anything at that time.
Not because the growler was broken.
No, I just don't think I knew what I was doing, and I think I pitched the yeast into it pretty hot and might have killed it all.
Yeah, there are some certain rules one must follow when making a healthy yeast starter. I first heard about yeast starters probably, it must have been early 2011 or so, just reading around forums and listening to podcasts and whatnot. And I pretty quickly just jumped on the bandwagon and convinced myself that it was the right way to do things without questioning it. I picked up some flasks and started making yeast starters. The one thing that I stand by this, that I did notice was that my fermentation seemed to kick off a lot quicker than when I was just pitching yeast directly. So that was one of the benefits, and we're going to get into that later. But yeah, it seems to me that nowadays, almost before things like fermentation temperature, people are, and perhaps because it's not very difficult and not too expensive, but people are jumping right into making yeast starters, propagating their yeast, and before they pitch it into their beer.
Yeah, I would agree. It definitely seems to be the prevailing wisdom online, and definitely something that it even seems that newer brewers are doing.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to be getting into the thinking behind yeast starters, the methods for making them, existing research, which is really interesting, as well as some experiments that we've done on the topic. Well, hey, the Brew Club is now a thing. And we announced this a couple weeks ago. It's not totally set just yet, but you can go and sign up to become a member over at thebrewclub.com. That's the BRUclub.com. It's free, and the idea really is just to bring like-minded brewers together to have something to kind of focus on. There are also a lot of brewers out there who don't have a local club to go to, and so the folks behind the Brew Club, which isn't us, I got to get that out there. This is a group of Brewlosophy fans who kind of came together to start a club. They thought it'd be a good club for the clubless, if you will, but also kind of like a side club for people who just want to have another club to do weird, non-conventional brewing stuff with. Which is, what's really cool is that this whole club got started, and it's now time for the National Homebrew competition. If you feel like submitting some weird beers under the Brew Club, you can do that. You can even submit your good beers or your, normally made beers under some other club. But this is all the idea of a group of guys who thought it would be fun to coalesce around a different type of club. So it's there. And honestly, it's up to the club to decide what they want to do. Since announcing this, I've heard from a few people who, I think they're kind of joking, but they're asking things like, are you just trying to make the biggest club and really vie for a win at the National Homebrew Competition? That's it. This isn't really my thing, so I that's not up to me. And while I personally think it'd be cool if members entered beers into competitions that were made using these unconventional methods or these short and shoddy methods, it's not up to me to dictate. So they're going to do what they want to do. And, I guess I don't really take it personal when people boo. So, Jake, what do you think about people entering like short and shoddy beers in competitions?
I think it's pretty funny. I've entered a few of the less conventional beers, brewed for various experiments. into competitions, and I've gotten a couple medals going that way, and it does feel kind of validating, I guess, when you look at the results of some of these experiments, and then you enter a beer brewed using those less than conventional methods and actually win something. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, I've won some awards for short, like really conventionally, at least, poorly brewed beers that tasted great. And I was talking with somebody about this recently, and their comment was either either the beers are fine, and these short and shoddy methods actually work, which is what I or these judges nowadays their palates have evolved to the point where they're just not very good, and and that's why these beers are faring well in competition. There's really no way to tell, but if you feel like doing that, you can head over to thebruclub.com to become a member now. Again, it's free. It's fun. I think it's going to be a really cool thing. Speaking of the National Homebrew Competition, those awards are announced at HomebrewCon, which this year is going to be in Portland, Oregon from June 28th to June 30th. Don't forget, this is an event for American Homebrewers Association members only. You can go sign up now at brewlosophy.com/AHA. It's going to be really rad. We're partnering with our friends from Yakima Valley Hops, Imperial Yeast, and Mecca Grade Estate Malt on a really unique booth at the expo where we'll be collecting data on a whole host of fun beers. Attendees are going to have the opportunity to have Jersey and Tim review their beers live. We'll be recording a couple of shows. We've got all sorts of crazy stuff planned. Again, that's June 28th through 30th. HomebrewCon in Portland, Oregon. You do not want to miss it. So I'm sure some of you have already heard or already seen some pictures on social media of the new packaging Imperial Yeast is using. Yep, they moved away from the cans purely to make their customers happy, which I think is cool. They could have kind of stuck with the cans. I thought they were working great. I was a fan of them, but because of the feedback that they were getting, they decided to make a change. And I can understand why. I read about some of the issues folks were having. Thankfully, Imperial still packs 200 billion cells into their new pitch-right pouches, over double what many other yeast labs include, and their cultures are guaranteed to be ready to turn your wort into delicious beer. We've been using Imperial Yeast for over a year now. It's a fantastic product that we're proud to endorse. Plus, the people behind the company are just as awesome. Check out what Imperial Yeast has to offer over at imperialyeast.com. Their product's also available right now at More Beer and Great Fermentations. I don't think they're selling direct to homebrewers, but we've got the links to those More Beer and Great Fermentations over at brewlosophy.com/support. If you live near any of the following cities and you think participating in our experimental antics sounds like fun, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and I'll put you in touch with the contributor you live nearest. I'm right here in Fresno, California, and we've got contributors in Chicago, Illinois, Anchorage, Alaska, Corona, California, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Pueblo, Colorado, and Denver, Colorado. In fact, Jake, I just forwarded a person to you this morning.
Yeah, we've actually had quite a good response with people reaching out from this call for tasters. So it's been exciting and pretty cool.
In order for us to do this thing, we need people to taste the beers. So and we like getting as many people involved as possible. So please feel free to reach out if you live anywhere near any of us. It'd be great. If you have questions for our Brew and A episodes, you can email them to me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, or you can drop them on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or any of the other online forums we frequent. We're currently kind of planning on making every 10th episode a Brew and A episode, but that can change based on what you guys want. So just let us know. You can give us feedback on that as well. Okay, time to move into some feedback. We got a couple things. These are a bit longer than usual, and I think they're really interesting, though. The first one, this is from Paul Shanks. He says, I just listened to episode 20. That was a Brew and A episode, and heard you guys talking about making a tea with the grains to get a better understanding of their characteristics and whatnot. He says he was curious to know if we have a write-up on how to do this. He says he scored a bunch of free specialty grain from a local nano brewery that supports our small homebrew club, and I think this would be a great way to understand these new malts. Some of them I've never heard of before. Jake, have you ever done grain teas before?
I have not. I mean, that's pretty rad that he got a bunch of specialty malts and wants to try this. I do think that Drew Beecham, our friend over at Experimental Brewing, has a nice video of how to make malt teas, I think using a coffee filter or maybe a coffee maker. But I would go check that out unless you've done any, Marshall.
I've never made a grain tea, actually. So that must have been, I know on that Brew and A was with Malcolm. So he may have done that before. I tend to just eat the grain and then kind of roll with what my perception is of the way they taste in my mouth. So yeah, I've read Drew's write up as well. That's what I would do. If you want, you can reach out to Malcolm at brewlosophy.com. He'll walk you through his process. But yeah, that's a good idea, I think. The other thing, Jake, you and I were recently talking about the difference between the way wort tastes compared to beer. And I kind of hesitate to determine what I think a malt is going to taste like based on anything other than how it is displayed in an actual beer.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, how many times have you gotten done brewing and you taste that wort and it's pretty gross? I mean, it's just overly bitter and tastes sweet and sickly. And then when that final beer comes, it tastes amazing.
Yeah.
So it can give you maybe a general idea, but I don't think it's necessarily best guidance in terms of how you're developing your recipes.
Yeah. Well, and who am I to say that chewing on grain kernels is any better or worse than making a grain tea? Because I've never done that. So, all right. Jeffrey Scheidler. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. He says he's been listening to the Brewlosophy podcast for a bit and he's really enjoying it. As someone who brews beer and works in science, listening to a quantitative approach to homebrewing is really fun for me. I have a quick comment with regards to your discussion of statistical significance. Now, I'm going to cut in here. This is a point that comes up often, and usually we'll get someone who, and this is going to sound like I'm being judgy, but who obviously doesn't have a good grasp of statistics, questioning our stuff. And what it always comes off to me as, or most of the time at least, is someone doesn't like a finding, and so they go and they dig for the simplest critique of stats, particularly the p-value. And then they throw that our way, and I've learned to ignore that stuff. Jeffrey here, I think it took a far more thoughtful approach, and I think it's something worthy of consideration. So here we go. He says, in listening to the most recent episode on hop bagging, there were contradictory findings, and I listened to you try to square them with interest. For the triangle test, enough people correctly identified the odd beer out to warrant a significant finding. Now, this is in the kettle hop experiment, the one where we compared bagged kettle hops to tossing them in loose. But the quantification from the IBU from the lab found them to be pretty much the same, right? So in your findings for this and all experiments, I think it's important to remember that frequentist statistics is simply an exercise in probability. When you administer a triangle test and look at the number of people that would need to pick out a beer, there is still the probability of error, both type 1 and type 2 errors. Okay, I'm going to come in again real quick here. Type 1 is a false positive. That means that a type 1 error would be a significant finding when it's not really significant. And then type 2 is a false negative. So we find a non-significant finding when it really is significant. So he says, in other words, two beers might be entirely the same, but by random chance, enough people say they are different, lucky guesses, leading you to falsely conclude there was an effect when there wasn't. Also, two beers can be truly different, but not enough people pick correctly, leading you to falsely believe the beers are the same, and there is no effect when there was. This whole topic has led to many lengthy debates about p-values and statistical significance in science that haven't really been settled. I think it's important to mention to listeners that more exBEERiments might be needed to tease out if there is really an effect for a lot of these variables, and if the results you found were spurious. There's no harm in admitting uncertainty and only encourages more people to test it. He says he really loves the show and to keep up the good work. Jake, we talk about this often.
We do. Unfortunately, we can't replicate something 10 times, as we're brewing it, and have those all be released the first time we release something. But replication is very important to confirm notions that are proposed by experiments, and we do work on getting back and replicating quite a few of the experiments. Also, I don't necessarily agree with his statement that those were contradictory findings, that tasters were significant, but yet IBUs were very similar. I mean, there could be other compounds just based on that variable, which aren't quantified as IBUs.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I have to believe he was just using that as an example. I don't think he's saying that the bitterness was the only way we'd be able to tell those beers apart, or that the fact that they were the same, but people still told them could tell them apart. But I like the essence of what he's getting to here, and that's that one of our single findings is not fact. It's not some universal truth now that we found it. And yeah, I get what people are saying. We write in a way that's kind of, it's conversational and it's fun and but we make it an effort to never, speak of a single result as truth. And now I have a personal preference for data over anecdote. That's my own thing. And I feel like this is a hobby that's been built on quite a bit of anecdote. But the essence of what he is talking about, yes, replication is important. Absolutely. We need to get back to it. And in a hobby like brewing, or in a field like brewing, you've got every single style out there that can all be tested on, every variable on each of those styles. I mean, it would take forever for just, our little crew to do that. And we encourage everyone out there to start doing some experimentation, test it out for yourself, share that data, because that's how we're going to get more knowledge. That's how we're going to get to where we want to be. Which is knowing a little bit more about this crazy, crazy thing. So thanks for the comment, Jeffrey. That was really, that was good feedback. If you want to help us continue creating this content, you can head over to brewlosophy.com/support, where you'll find a list of links to use when shopping for homebrew ingredients online. One of the easiest ways you can support us without feeling a thing. It really does help us out a ton. Now, if you want a little something in return for your support, check out our Patreon, where for as little as $1 a month, you'll be granted access to never before published Brewlosophy recipes. You'll get access to a private brew crew forum. You'll get unique discounts to Yakima Valley Hops, everyone's favorite hop supplier, and more. In fact, one of our new rewards for 2018 is a monthly Q&A live cast with a special guest. And for January, we've got the author of American Sour Beers, the mad fermentationist himself, Michael Tonsmeyer, is going to be our guest. He's in the middle of building a brewery with Scott Janish called Sapwood Cellars, so he can answer questions on that, as well as sour beers, New England IPA, and anything else you want to ask him. That's the $5 per month level. That's actually the $3 per month level. You can check it and all of our other rewards out over at patreon.com/brewlosophy. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Brewlosophy podcast and leave a review wherever it is you listen to your podcast. They help a ton, and it's really easy for you to do. So maybe 8 to 10 years ago, I was having pizza. We have a local pizza shop called Popolo's. It's like it used to be an old school, like 80s pizzeria, great pizza. And they're known for having 2 or 3 decent craft beers on. And I was sitting in there eating pizza, and I saw they had Firestone Walker Union Jack on. I'd never had this beer. It was my first time. So I ordered it. First time seeing it. So I ordered a Union Jack, big old 22 ounce, glass, or 20 ounce glass came out. And I remember taking that first sip and thinking, this is my jam. This is my style of beer. It had just the right, kind of blend, in my opinion, of that floral, citrusy, fruity, and kind of a touch of spice almost to it. That made my mouth water. It was delicious. So I drink a lot of Union Jack, and thankfully Firestone is really close to where I live, so we get fresh stuff here all the time. Well, mid last year, I'm talking to my buddy Jersey, and he's over at his place. He wants me to come over and have a few beers with him. I tell him I don't feel like walking to his house, but that he should come over here and have a few beers with me. So he does that, and he brings a shopping bag full of Firestone Walker beers that he said he had sitting next to his fridge. All right, wonderful, right? So he brings this bag of beers, sets them next to my fridge out in my garage. This is June, and if anyone is familiar with the weather here in Fresno, California, June isn't known for necessarily being too temperate. It's quite warm, especially in garages. And so those beers just sat next to my fridge for a little while. And eventually, about 6 months later, I tossed them in the back of my fridge and then pulled a Union Jack out that was bottled in May of 2017. In November, we recorded a 1-minute beer review with Jersey and Tim, and I wanted to see what they thought of this old Firestone Walker Union Jack.
1-minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
That smells terrible.
This is not me.
I don't even want to taste it. 1-minute beer review, Tim.
This is soap.
Drink the whole thing.
It's not like lingering in my mouth forever. So
okay, that's good.
I like that.
Like it goes away. It goes into your stomach, like biologically. God, how do you feel?
It's just something I wouldn't drink. It's not awful, but
What country is it from?
I really don't want to drink it.
You don't want to drink it?
No.
Oh my God. So you tapping out? Are you tapping out? All right, I'm in. Doesn't smell like anything. Tastes terrible, but the glass is really nice. It has a Brewtron on it.
I've had worse. It doesn't taste terrible.
I mean, it's not.
It's just not me.
It's not. Billions of listeners who won't drink this beer if we rate it bad. We gotta think about this, Timmy. I don't like it. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. Actually, you know what? I kind of do like it. I would drink it if I had to, but I wouldn't choose it. There were 75 beers and like choose one. I wouldn't choose this one. I just tried smelling the microphone instead of the beer.
was that?
It's growing on me. Actually, I don't want to do this, but I kind of like it. I mean, it's all right. If I had to
it's
drink
fine
it,
if
I'd
you
start
like it.
liking it. I'd start liking it, I think.
It is growing on me as well. But first impression, no.
I feel like my first impression happened because of your first impression. You're my friend and you biased me. I actually like this beer.
Well, there you go.
No, you screwed it up. That's it. Just drink it. We are terminating our friendship.
Well, I got to be honest. As much as I like Union Jack, I did have some of this beer with the guys. And I kind of agree. I started off thinking, man, this really isn't good. It wasn't as oxidized, or it didn't have the off flavors I expected for it being over 6 months old, which says to me that Firestone Walker really is putting in a lot of effort to keep their beer as fresh as possible for as long as possible. It definitely wasn't as good as a fresh Union Jack, but still drinkable. Is Jake? Have you ever had Union Jack before?
I have. I don't have as cool of a story as you getting it at some local pizza shop. I don't know when I first had it, but it is one of my favorite West Coast examples of a pale ale or an IPA.
Yeah. It's my go-to. Hands down. It's what I get. It's what I have easy access to. To this day, fresh Union Jack's probably my favorite. West Coast or American IPA. Even older, I'll be honest. Even this older version of it was better than some IPAs that I've had fresh. So make of that what you will. If you want to have your beer featured on the 1 Minute Beer Review with Jersey and Tim, we've got a whole bunch of stuff being sent into us. You can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. All right, we've got to give some love to the folks who make this show possible. When we come back from these brief messages, we're going to be talking about yeast starters. Shopping for brewing supplies online can be a real hassle, which is why we recommend Love to Brew. They've got great prices, super fast shipping, and they carry exclusive products like East Coast Yeast, the Brewer's Essentials brand, and their award-winning beer recipe kits. They're also the only place you can pick up your very own Brewlosophy recipe kit. The numbers don't lie. Love to Brew has hundreds of 5-star reviews, and thousands of brewers are choosing them for their supplies and ingredients each year. Experience the difference at lovetobrew.com. That's love, the number 2, brew.com. The best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world. Find everything from classics to modern favorites, as well as cool experimental varieties and a vast array of ingredients and gear at yakimavalleyhops.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste time chilling work, which is why I use cleverly designed immersion chillers from Jaded Brewing. After some bad experiences with counterflow and plate chillers, I began the search for a more efficient chilling solution and discovered Jaded. That was nearly 4 years ago, and to this day, I continue to rely on the King Cobra and the Hydra to chill my wort in record time without the setup or cleaning hassle of other chillers. If you're looking for a way to optimize your brew day, I can't recommend Jaded chillers enough. Go see what they have to offer at jadedbrewing.com and let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Founded in 1978 by brewing pioneer Charlie Papazian, the American Homebrewers Association is a division of the Brewers Association focused specifically on protecting and promoting the hobby of homebrewing. In addition to their work lobbying for the rights of homebrewers across the country, they're also the primary sponsor of Brewlosophy.com. By joining the AHA, not only are you supporting their cause, but you get a ton of benefits as well. Discounts at breweries across the U.S., early access to tickets for events like the Great American Beer Festival, and you get to attend HomebrewCon, the world's biggest gathering of homebrewers. Head over to brewlosophy.com/AHA now to sign up to become a member. Pretty much every brewer I know these days propagates their yeast in a starter, at least for most of the beers they brew. I've been doing it religiously for over 6 years now under the belief that it has some qualitative impact on my beer. What exactly is a yeast starter?
So a yeast starter is essentially a small beer. Generally, it's a low gravity, unhopped beer that you're making purely for the purposes of growing up yeast from a smaller count to a larger count to be able to pitch, quote unquote, appropriately into the beer that you're going to be brewing. The main thing, again, what a starter does is to increase that cell count, but also it has the added benefit of kind of proofing the yeast for any bakers out there or dough makers, kind of making sure that yeast is good to go You might have been shipped the yeast if you live in a place that's not close to a local homebrew store. That yeast could have been shipped warm or too cold and might not have been in the most ideal condition for survival. In a starter, we'll kind of make sure that yeast is good to go.
Right. Yeah. You make a good point that in baking and in so many other, areas where yeast is used, it's very common to proof that yeast, to get it going before you actually put it to work. Right. And that's the way I view starters is, in addition to creating a higher cell count, which thereby improves the yeast's viability. You're also waking them up, right? They're so that they're ready to go when they hit that wort. Like you said, it's also a good test, of whether that yeast is actually alive. I think, Jake, you were mentioning earlier on that you don't even think your first starter you made ended up working out because you might have murdered those little yeasties by pitching them into too hot of wort, huh?
Yeah, yep, I think so. I don't think I was, I'm still not very patient, but I think I was less so patient when I first started brewing.
Right. I'm still terribly impatient. I mean, that's short and shoddy. That's how it was born.
Right.
There are some other purported benefits, at least, to making yeast starters. One of them is that it reduces the risk of off flavors that can be caused from yeast that's just not ready to ferment.
Right. Some of the commonly stated wisdom or held wisdom is that underpitching yeast or pitching yeast that takes too long to ferment can cause stress on the yeast, which can express itself in various different esters or phenols or different compounds and precursors that could lead to off flavors down the road as fermentation is winding down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, there are certain styles. I know Malcolm and I have talked about how when he's making, I believe it's Hefeweizen, he actually prefers underpitching. And by underpitching, we're talking about just throwing a single pack of yeast direct into the wort in order to encourage those certain esters and phenols that he's looking to get into that beer. So there seems to be some belief that pitch count actually has an impact on those certain characteristics. I've got an example myself. Back in, I think it was like 2012, so quite a while ago, I got an itch to brew one day. I didn't prepare for anything. And I thought, I'm going to make a simple kolsch. I had some, it was actually harvested yeast that I'd harvested from an earlier batch. And it was sitting in my fridge. So I pulled it out at the beginning of the brew day and let that jar warm up and made my kolsch to just quick brew in a bag brew day and threw a fermentation bucket full of this wort into my fermentation chamber, temperature controlled to about 66, 67 degrees. And with confidence, I pitched this harvested yeast that was fresh. It looked good. I shouldn't say it was fresh. It looked like it was decent. It wasn't like peanut butter brown, but it was pretty old. I realized that, the date on it was about 6 months prior to this brew day. Tossed it in there. After 24 hours, I didn't notice any activity whatsoever, which is really, that's kind of a bad sign. And then the next day, when I got home from work, my entire garage smelled like somebody had burnt out in my car, in a car in my garage, that just had this burnt rubber, nasty smell. And the culprit was this beer fermenting in my chamber. That burnt rubber smell is a phenol, usually associated with unhealthy yeast or unhealthy fermentation. So
that's really gross,
dude. It was so gross. And I think just for posterity, I took a sip of this. I let it ferment out, and I took a little sample for myself, and it was god awful. Oh my God.
Oh, when I first started making yeast starters, I had actually tried to harvest some yeast from a bottle and think I had something pretty similar to that, which not good.
Yeah. I think that has to do, what I could find about the burnt rubber thing when I researched it is that it's not just pitch count, but it's also the health of the yeast that you're pitching into the beer. So obviously yeast matters, and yeast stress can produce these off flavors that you really don't want in your beer. Another reason people make yeast starters is that it results in a quicker start to fermentation.
Yeah, exactly. That lag time. So people generally talk about fermentation in a few different phases. The first being the lag time, and that lag time is a chance for bacteria to contaminate the wort, before alcohol is present and before yeast can outcompete various types of wild yeast and bacteria. Generally, good sanitation reduces that risk pretty low. But again, a quicker start to fermentation or an appropriate lag time is something that's definitely desired. Also, pitching a yeast starter can result in fermentation finishing faster. We'll get into that a little bit later based on some of the experiments we've done. But again, those phases of fermentation, the final one is that stationary phase where yeast is just consuming any leftover compounds created during fermentation and cleaning that beer up. And a starter helps you get to that phase faster and potentially finish fermentation quicker.
Which is never bad to have, your beer done sooner, in my opinion.
Especially if you're a commercial brewery where, time spent fermenting is, time you're not making money off that specific batch of beer.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've noticed, this is just completely, personal experience here, but, I've absolutely observed, fermentation to kick in much faster when I'm pitching active yeast starters. Even, to me, the sweet spot is about 24 to 36 hours after making the starter. In fact, I'm brewing tomorrow and I'll be making the starter. I plan to pitch tomorrow, maybe around 5 p.m. and I'll make the starter sometime today. So it'll be about, 36 hours, maybe about 30 hours or so before I actually pitch that. And I found that though, when I've got that active, there's still maybe a little bit of Kreuzen fermentation activity going on in my starter, that seems to kick fermentation off even quicker than if I build it up for 48 or more, hours, 2 to 3 days. And I think a part of that is, and we're going to get into this in a whole other show, but I think what you're doing there is you're kind of, you're finding the sweet spot between viability and vitality. But we'll get into that in another show. Like I said, those quick starts to fermentation are great because I think a lot of homebrewers have anxiety issues when it comes to beer, waiting for beer to start fermenting.
Yeah. How many times have you gone and taken a look at your beer and, just kind of want to watch it ferment?
I know. I mean, I've brewed, hundreds of batches at this point, and every time I pitch yeast, it's like, all right, here we go. Let's see if this works again. It still feels sort of magical to me. But starters do,
for sure.
Yeah, starters do help decrease that time. And like you said earlier, it also can help to, just hasten the amount of fermentation that's required altogether. So that's good as well. Finally, I think another purported benefit is that it reduces the chance of a stuck fermentation. Anyone who's ever had a stuck fermentation knows how frustrating that can be.
Yeah. So what a stuck fermentation really is your yeast peters out while there's still extract left that it could consume. Really, you'd have to do some sort of forced fermentation test to know if you have a stuck fermentation. But say you fermented a beer that started at 1006 gravity and kind of stopped fermenting at 1004. Then maybe you have a stuck fermentation. In pitching a yeast starter might be able to reduce the risk of that happening in the future.
Yeah, there's numerous causes to stuck fermentation. I think, some of them aren't really stuck fermentation. You accidentally use the wrong grains or something. But pitching a yeast starter can be kind of insurance against that. And I've never had a stuck fermentation due to yeast. But if it can help, why not? Right. So,
right.
Jake, I want to dig in a little bit more on pitch rates. This is, making yeast starters, the whole idea, I think the primary idea is that you are going to you're going to increase the amount of yeast you're actually tossing into your wort, thereby kind of, increasing the confidence that those yeast are going to actually ferment that wort.
Yeah. So here at Brewlosophy, when we talk about yeast starters, we've been known to talk about vitality versus viability. So today we're really talking about the viability starters. So increasing that cell count to hit a reported pitch rate that's commonly accepted in the brewing industry. So what those pitch rates, which are commonly accepted, some will say about 1 million cells per milliliter per degree Plato. People will reduce that for ale down to 0.75. So 750,000 cells per milliliter per degree Plato, and then double that for lagers to 1.5 million cells per milliliter per degree Plato, due to that lower fermentation temperature. So what does this really mean? So say we have a beer that's 1055 gravity, so that would be 13.5 Plato. We can just plug that into this formula and figure out how many cells we're going to need, which would be our pitch rate. So for an ale, it would be right around 200 billion cells for a 1055 beer. For a lager, that would be closer to 380. So it's basically double of what the ale pitch rate is.
Right.
And then also, if you bump that beer up to, say, 1080, all of a sudden for an ale, you need 270 billion cells, and for a lager, you need 540. So you can see as you increase that gravity, the pitch rate increases that number of cells that you need, quite substantially and pretty quickly.
Yeah. In essence, there's a kind of this linear relationship between original gravity and the pitch rate. And so, at 1055 OG, which is, that's a pretty standard, I think, ale lager, gravity. You're basically going to need, depending on the style that you're making, or really the temperature that you're fermenting at. I think it's more of a temperature thing, not necessarily a style thing. So if you're fermenting a lager warm, you can go with ale pitch rates, in my experience. But that's going to determine the amount of cells that you need. And thankfully, you don't have to sit down with a calculator or with a pencil and paper to figure this out. There are online calculators available. You can go to brewunited.com. They've got a great one. There's all kinds out there. I think yeast.ninja is a new one that I saw that's pretty great. And they'll figure all that for you. So here's the issue, right? Most yeast labs that are providing homebrewers with yeast are only packaging about 100 billion cells. And there's some evidence, like people who have done some yeast counts have shown that even though they're saying you're getting 100 billion cells, sometimes it's as low as about 60 billion cells. So you're getting way lower, obviously, immensely lower than what the recommended pitch rate is. And so in order to bring those pitch rates up, you got to make a starter, especially if you're making a lager.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know that's something I've fretted over a lot as an early home brewer, somebody who hadn't quite adopted starters yet was, do you buy extra packs of yeast to get to that cell count that you need, or do you just wing it, pitch a pack and go? Really, it's a conundrum. Some new labs recently have come out and started marketing packages like Imperial Yeast with 200 billion cells, which is great if you're pitching, that standard OG ale, even a little bit higher OG ale. It's going to hit that cell count that you reportedly want for fermentation.
Yeah. Like you said, 200 billion cells is great to pitch direct into a standard moderate OG ale. But there are other things that a yeast starter does as well, like wake those yeast up. So, we're still making starters when we're using Imperial yeast for the most part.
Yeah, exactly. And most homebrewers too are faced kind of with that conundrum. Like, what do we do to make up that yeast difference? Do you buy more? That's expensive. Based on a per weight basis, yeast is the most expensive part of your brew day, most likely.
Yeah, certainly more expensive than a little bit of malt extract.
Yeah, for sure. I know. I used to figure out the cost per batch quite a bit. I don't really know why I did. I'm just curious.
Because you're an accountant, Jake. That's what people like you do.
I believe like the standard cost for ingredients is close to $20 for like a moderate OG. And then you tack that yeast on there, and it's an extra, basically 50%.
Yeah. Yeast is the most expensive part of brewing. Real quick, before we head to break, I want to talk a little bit about how to make a yeast starter. I think, it's pretty easy. Basically, you take some form of malt extract. Everyone I know uses dry malt extract, but you can use real extract from a batch of beer. You can use dry malt extract or liquid malt extract. You using the calculator, one of these online calculators of your choice, you determine the size of the starter that you're going to need for the beer that you're making. You mix the recommended amount of extract with water. You boil that for a few minutes. I've been boiling mine for 5 minutes lately, and I'm not having any issues with that. You chill that wort, you toss your yeast in, and then you let it ferment for a day or two before you pitch it into your beer. Now, an optional piece of gear is a stir plate, and there's some argument lately that intermittent shaking is more effective than a stir plate, but stir plates are easier for those of us who aren't around our starters enough to shake them all the time. That sound about right? Is that how you're making starters, Jake?
Yeah, I'm going with, I think, 10 grams per milliliter of water. or is it 100? I can't remember, but boil it or mix it together, boil it, chill it, and throw it on that stir plate.
Yeah.
Stir plate I found it works great and reaches, I think, peak cell density across the starter in like 18 hours.
Yeah. My experience with the stir plate is that it's worked really well. I mean, it's not causing any issues. One other option, something that I did a while back, and this is another thing our friend Drew Beecham kind of promotes a bit, or has written about at the very least, is canning wort that you're going to use for your starter. And it's a pretty clever idea if, basically what you're doing is making these smaller batches of jarred, like mason jarred wort that you then put into a pressure cooker so that it's completely sterile. And then let it, you let these jars of wort chill off and you tighten those lids, and then you can let them hang out on your shelf in your garage. And then when you want to make a starter, you go snag a jar of wort, toss it in your flask, and pitch your yeast. You don't have to go through the whole starter making process. I found it really convenient when I wasn't brewing very often to do this, but if I would end up using 2 of those jars. I think I could make something like 6 or 8 jars at a time, and I would use 2 per batch, and I was usually making 2 batches for experiments. And so I was going through 4 of these things, per brew day. And so it wasn't really, it was easier almost just to make my yeast starters kind of in the moment. But it is a cool option for people who are brewing a little bit less than we do. And you can find that, I believe it's on the Maltos Falcons website, how to can your wort for yeast starters. So yeah, all kinds of stuff. We've been making starters for years, but has the effort really been worth it? That's what we were wondering. And when we get back from this break, we're going to dig into some of the experiments we've done on yeast starters and pitch rate. When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, did you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge, and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
As believers in the necessity of making yeast starters and making sure to pitch proper rates of yeast into our wort, I remember talking with Ray, this was a couple years ago now, about, really how much does it matter? We had been doing a lot of experiments that were returning non-significant results. And so Ray and I were like, hey, let's do an experiment that is bound to return a significant result. And what we settled on was comparing a single pack of yeast to a yeast starter, so an under pitch versus a standard, like a recommended pitch rate. And Ray ended up doing this experiment, making a beer and comparing these two.
Yeah. So in the first real pitch rate experiment with, comparing yeast necessity of a yeast starter to not. So Ray brewed up a batch of his favorite West Coast amber, which eventually became the Make America Amber. He brewed up 10 gallons of that, split it post-boil into 2 fermenters. The calculator noted that he would need approximately 237 billion cells of yeast to ferment this, being a 1063 gravity beer. Into one beer, he pitched a single vial, which, based on date and a formula that calculates yeast cell death, would have about 56 billion cells. The other pitch with the starter at the correct rate would have about 400% more yeast cells at pitching. As we'd expect, the starter beer took off a little bit faster than the single vial pitched beer after about 7 hours. It took about 31 hours, is what Ray noted, for the single vial pitched beer to start to look like it was fermenting and get a little bit of krausen. Meanwhile, the starter beer was already blowing off into the blow-off tube that he had on there. Ray did take some more gravity measurements than we would normally do, just due to the nature of this experiment. So after 4 days, the starter beer was at 1.018 gravity, while the single vial beer was at 1.024. So about a six gravity point difference after 4 days between these two. However, after 9 days, the single vial beer had caught up, and they had both fermented down to 1015, which was the final gravity for this specific beer. So we can definitely see some objective differences in this fermentation. The beer pitched with the starter fermented faster, started faster, finished faster, just looked like it had an overall better fermentation experience than the single vial.
Pretty much what we'd expect based on what the advocates of yeast starters are saying in many ways, right? That that the fermentation was quicker, it started faster, and from that we can sort of extrapolate that at the very least there was less risk of producing off flavors in the starter pitched batch.
For sure, but that the dogma is still there that due to this fermentation experience, there might be some different esters or some different compounds in that more stressed fermentation. So we put this beer to participants. So Ray had 20 participants in this specific experiment. At 20, we would need 11 to obtain a p-value of 0.05, which we used to establish significance. In the end, only nine participants selected the correct beer, which means this did not achieve a significant result based on our p-value recommendations of 0.05.
Which I think now what that means doesn't mean the beers weren't different. It means that a reliable number of participants weren't able to distinguish the odd beer out in a triangle test, meaning that they were similar enough that any differences just weren't glaring. Interestingly, I thought it was pretty interesting that Ray, in his 2 attempts, I don't know why he only did 2 attempts, but in his 2 attempts, he was able to select the odd beer out. He said that he perceived the starter beer as having slightly more hop aroma with slightly less sharp flavor, whatever that is. When he tried them later on after doing his triangle test, he chose the wrong one as being the one he thought was pitched with the starter. So it could be that his 2 correct ones were a guess. He says that for a beer he was nervous about, given the early fermentation being so sluggish, he was pretty pleased with how subtle the differences that he picked up were, and that neither of the beers were bad. So pretty interesting result there.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, early home brewing me, who was into all these like dogmatic things, would have definitely said that those beers were going to taste different. And I can say that with confidence.
Well, it's funny because I would have too. But I know I have heard from easily hundreds of homebrewers who just don't make starters, and they read Brewlosophy, they listen to this podcast, and they hit me up and they're like, dude, I'm making good beer. I think my beer's good, and I'm not pitching starters. So, there's definitely enough anecdote out there to counter the dogma, as you're calling it, about yeast starters. But I think even just that first experiment did support this idea that you are reducing the risk for issues, but just merely by the fact that the fermentation is starting quicker and it's going faster.
Right. And these were both lab grown yeasts, which is one thing we do have to kind of state, that probably means they're a lot healthier than, say, harvested yeast.
Yeah. That's an issue we're going to hit on in an upcoming show. There are differences between lab grown and harvested yeast, home brewer harvested yeast. Curious about these findings though. Ray decided to kind of perform another pitch rate experiment where what he did is he pitched. This one was using dry yeast, and we haven't hit too much on dry yeast. There's a lot of talk out there about, don't make starters with dry yeast because it's cheaper just to pitch a couple extra packs. In this day and age, I actually think dry yeast has gone up in price a little bit, so making a starter might not be such a bad idea. But in this one, he brewed up a lager wort, and then in one pitched a single pack of the popular SAF lager W3470 in one half, and then in the other one he pitched 5 packs. Again, the goal of this one was to compare any differences caused by underpitch versus a pretty significant overpitch. Jake, what are the numbers on that in terms of how underpitched and how overpitched each of these batches was?
So it's kind of confusing. I guess we don't really know exactly how many cells are in each sachet. Per the manufacturer, it's about 70 billion cells, but most people use 200 billion cells based on counts done by various homebrewers. So we'll just use 200 billion cells since that's commonly accepted. So one sachet at 200 billion cells would be about a 50% underpitch for this fest beer that Ray brewed. And the other one that had 5 sachets, which is about a trillion cells, is about a 250% overpitch. So,
well, and
substantial difference.
Yeah. So he made a fest beer that was 1056 OG. So this was again right around that kind of moderate, gravity, wort. But he also cold fermented it. So these beers were going to be fermented cool. And into one, he pitched 1 pack, so a 50% underpitch, and the other one he pitched 5, so a 250% overpitch. Before we get into talking about the data, Jake, what did you expect from this one?
I don't really know. Like, I haven't explored overpitching too much. There is some talk that overpitching tends to not be as harmful as underpitching, but I thought that maybe at 5 sachets he might be getting close to getting some problems with overpitching, but. Really, I just kind of strapped in and was ready for the ride on this one.
We've stopped having expectations. I completely expected this one to come back significant. Mostly, what I thought was going to happen is that all of that yeast, so much yeast being added to the overpitch batch, was going to leave some sort of like a bready, yeasty character that the underpitch one wouldn't do. Now, I was biased because I've fermented a ton of cool fermented lager using a single pack of 3470, and it always worked out well in my experience. But this overpitch thing, which I guess to hit a little bit on what some of the issues with overpitching can be, I've heard that it can produce kind of a watery, less flavorful, a less lower bodied beer than expected. I've overpitched a little bit before in the past and haven't noticed any issues, but that's some of the argument out there. But yeah, my expectation was that this overpitch batch was going to taste like yeast, basically.
Yeah, and based on some of the research I did, overpitching in various studies, which is mainly testing high gravity wort, because that's what many commercial breweries are interested in as it relates to yeast pitch rate. The higher pitch rates in higher gravity beers presented more acetaldehyde in certain other precursors. But yeah, so overpitching definitely can lead to quantifiable differences in the beer. But what did Ray observe in this experiment? So after just 3 days, the overpitch beer was fermenting away. Dry yeast does seem to have a longer lag phase, which kind of makes sense. That yeast had been dried to basically a powder and then rehydrated before it was pitched. So after 3 days, the overpitch beer was fermenting very well, while the underpitch beer had just begun to develop a krausen. So again, that same thing as the first experiment, faster fermentation from the beer pitched with more yeast, which makes sense. After only 12 days, both beers had fermented down to a final gravity of 1013. So same as the first experiment, we didn't get an under attenuation here. Both beers fermented to the same final gravity. But what would the data say? So Ray served this to 15 participants. We would need 9 correct responses to establish significance. And in the end, only 5 participants correctly identified the odd beer out, which means we were not able to, with any confidence, say that these beers were distinguishable.
Yeah, and 5 out of 15 is exactly 1/3. 15 people isn't that's not a huge sample. We all understand that. But if these beers tasted different, I would expect more than 1/3 of those 15 to be able to distinguish the odd beer out in a triangle test, and that's just not the case. That's not what happened. Only 5 of 15 people picked the right one, which means they had they guessed right. So this is another one. Ray says that he kept tricking himself on this one. He'd pour himself samples of both beers to evaluate. And at first he would think he could tell a difference, but then he'd wait a few minutes before taking more sips, only to find that what he thought was different had, the cups had been switched, basically. His performance on blind triangle tests, he did 3 of them, and he was able to select the unique sample 1 time. Exactly 1/3. And he even admitted that it was just a guess. So I think, you combine his experience with that, blind triangle test data from the participants, and it would really seem like, again, underpitching and overpitching didn't produce a reliably distinguishable beer. Doesn't mean they weren't different on some level, some other level, but people didn't seem to be able to taste a difference.
Yep, this result blew my mind for sure.
I mean, me too, man. There was another. We did another pitch rate experiment. One of the big arguments, and this one made a lot of sense to me as well, but they have all kind of made sense to me. Is that when it's pitch rate is good insurance all the way around, regardless of whether it produces a reliably distinguishable difference, whatever. But it is especially important when you're making a high gravity beer, something like, say, a Russian Imperial Stout. So our contributor, Matt Del Fiacco, decided to put this one to the test recently. He made a Imperial Stout of 1.115. That's 1115 OG. I've never made a beer so big in my life, but he did it. And for this, it would require, at that rate, it would require a minimum of 450 billion cells for his 4.5 gallon batch. That's 450 billion cells for his 4.5 gallon batch. He used a Imperial Yeast, can of yeast, which comes with 200 billion cells. And so what he did is he pitched direct into one of the batches of this 1115 OG Imperial Stout wort, and then he built up a properly sized starter and pitched that into another batch and let them both ferment.
Yep, and after 4 weeks, the one with the single can had fermented down to only 1.031, while the beer with the starter had fermented down to 1.029. Now, due to Matt's system size, he had to brew 2 separate beers here, so the limit of attenuation there could mean a stalled fermentation in the underpitched beer. It could mean some slight differences between the 2 batches. We can't say with any confidence on that one. Because Matt does ferment in corning kegs, we were not able to observe any differences during fermentation in terms of takeoff and when that krausen died down between the 2. But we can probably assume it was a little bit quicker in the beer pitch with the starter just based on prior experiences. So in the end, though, what would the data say? 22 participants were polled in this specific experiment. At 22, we would need 12 to establish significance. In the end, only 10 selected the correct beer. So we were not able to say with any reliability that these beers were distinguishable by participants.
God, I don't know about you, but this one again, I feel like I'm hanging on, to this idea that at the very least, pitching a yeast starter has some sort of qualitative impact on the perceivable characteristics of the beer we make. But even in this crazy high OG Imperial Stout made by Matt, pitching a single can, and there are numerous reasons it could be that, Imperial Yeast is just so high in quality and that 200 cells did its thing and whatnot. But man, I mean, you've got 200 compared to 450 billion cells. I would expect a difference there.
Yeah, I think we all would too. And I mean, the fact is with these pitch rate experiments, you are seeing differences in fermentation. The lag time is less. fermentation finishes up faster, it just seems natural that there needs to be some sort of flavor differences. But when the people brewing these and the participants tasting these beers aren't able to establish significance, it's kind of shocking.
Yeah, I agree. In talking with Matt about this, he told me that he was able, he did 4 kind of semi-blind triangle tests himself. He picked the unique sample 2 out of those 4 times, but he told me straight up those were just guesses. That he was trying his best and made those 2 correct guesses. Said that he didn't detect any off flavors at all in either of the beers. They tasted similar, and he told me that in chats with participants from this experiment that none of them commented on off flavors as well. So pretty fascinating. People are going to look at this and say 10 out of 22. That's different than 1/3, and it is, but it's not enough to reach that threshold. I mean, you consider the fact that a majority still couldn't detect a difference. That says something.
It does. Yeah, it definitely says something. And I think Matt, as a lover of the high OG beers, really wanted this one to be significant. And the fact that he was just guessing in his triangle test, I think really tells you, a lot there.
Yeah, no joke. Well, I guess what this means, you take it when we put all of these findings together. Obviously, all this talk about pitching proper cell counts by making yeast starters is just bunk, right?
I mean, not necessarily. When we look at these pitch rates and we look at the research behind them, where do these numbers come from? That 0.75, that 1.5? We've not really been able to find any solid evidence for where these numbers come from. They just seem to be what people have been using forever. Commercial breweries, that is. And we have to remember that commercial breweries are repitching yeast from fermentation to fermentation, which means they're pitching depleted yeast cells into new wort. And like you said, you'll get into talking about lab grade yeast versus repitched yeast in a future episode. But that could be why we're not seeing significance with these pitch rates, but yet commercial breweries are using those pitch rates.
So this idea of a 0.75 million cells per milliliter per degree Plato, and 1.5 million for lagers. This is fascinating to me. You did some digging, and I don't want to over focus on this because I do think that making starters is still valid. I don't think it's bunk, but we in our research we couldn't necessarily find any existing empirical evidence supporting these as being in any way necessary. It almost seems like, at least in our conversations, I think the first time we see this recommendation is in a book written by George Fix. Is that true? And that there's he doesn't cite any research from the past to support this. It's just a recommendation that seems to have become kind of this accepted truth.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. Malcolm found that for us, and I think it was an older book. I think his book was first published in the 90s. But yeah, it talks about those pitch rates that we commonly accept now, and it's an unsourced type assertion.
Yeah, there's no citation in there. There's no reference to previous research. I think it's a valid recommendation. But again, it's as far as we can tell, and this is no disrespect to Mr. Fix, it seems like it's just a recommendation. We all make them all the time, and this one just happened to catch fire and become dogma in some way. And I can tell you on my personal experience, I've overpitched, I've underpitched both ale and lager, and in my experience, I can't relate necessarily any issues to either of those that I've had. Both of them have worked fine for me. And if I've made any changes based on these experiments that we've done, and I'll admit from what I've heard from other people who aren't necessarily adhering so strongly to pitch rate, gospel, I guess, it's that I actually don't use calculators much anymore. I'll take, just kind of in my head, I'll take the freshness of the yeast that I'm using. So if I have a pack of imperial yeast that's, a month old, and I'm making a 1055, 10 gallons of a 1055 OG ale. What I do for ease for the experiment, and actually is kind of what drives this, is I'll just make a 2 liter starter so that I can easily split it, 1 liter per batch. And that's what I'll do. I'm not measuring it out. I'm not focusing too much on the specific cell count as I am making sure, that these yeast are just ready to go. To me, that feels, I don't know, on the homebrew level, at least, it feels a little bit more important in my mind.
Yeah. And I mean, I know you are famous for the yeast harvesting method that a lot of people attribute to Brewlosophy and to you, but for the most part, you're doing this with fresh lab grade yeast pitches, right?
Yeah. Nowadays, I think, that's a good point. Is I'm my starters are being propagated from fresh yeast.
I mean, and again, with the starter and with all these experiments, just because we haven't been able to demonstrate a taste difference, it doesn't mean there isn't one. We've observed differences in fermentation. We've observed fermentation kicking off quicker, finishing faster. So in the end, we don't really know. It seems to be doing something, pitching amounts of yeast based on these recommended counts, but anecdotally, they seem to taste the same.
Yeah. What have you made any changes to your process at all because of these?
Generally I'm brewing 10 gallons at a time. So instead of buying extra yeast and direct pitching, which would be under pitching based on these rates, I'm usually just making a starter for ease. That way I can just use 1 vial for 1 brew day. Also, it's ensuring consistency. Since we're doing experiments, we want to be as consistent as possible and do as many best practices as possible other than the specific variable we're looking at. I'm comfortable pitching directly, especially for the yeast manufacturers like Imperial, which are packaging 200 billion cells, considering it's fresh.
I agree with you. So it's not that I've made any big changes. I still do yeast starters. Another thing that we do a lot of with Brewlosophy nowadays is vitality starters. Stay tuned. We're going to have an episode on that in the future. Real quick, if you search our experiments list for pitch rate, you're going to find one more experiment that we did comparing ale and lager pitch rates in a Kolsch. It's the only one so far that's returned a significant result, and we're not ignoring it because we don't like those findings. But the reason we're not addressing it in this show is or at least in too much detail, is because there's some speculation that there was an extraneous variable impacting those results. Malcolm brewed that beer. He used some Post-it notes that had a really strong smell, and it just so happened that those Post-it notes were seemingly impacting the unique sample that was being selected. So if you'd like to read more about that experiment or anything else we're up to, you can head over to brewlosophy.com and check it out. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.